Okay, thank you very much. And I'm delighted that Amin Maalouf has agreed to take part in this year's Lahore Literary Festival. I'm grateful to Ahmed Rashid and to Razi to have organized this talk, and I'm very honored to introduce Amin Maalouf, who's a well-known and respected author and intellectual in France. France has been a long-time supporter of the festival, which is a very important one. It has a central place in Lahore's cultural scene and in the region. We see such literary exchanges between France and Pakistan, between French authors and intellectuals and Pakistani and other nationality authors and intellectuals as a very important and meaningful way to build mutual understanding. While it's not easy to summarize the breadth and depth of the work of such a great author as Amin Maalouf, I would like to introduce him, introduce his life and work to the audience of LLF. Amin Maalouf was born in Lebanon in 1949. After studying economics and sociology, he started a career as a foreign correspondent and sometimes as a war reporter for the Beirut newspaper An-Nahar. He covered momentous events like the downfall of the Ethiopian monarchy, the fall of Saigon, and the Islamic Revolution in Iran. He also reported on events in South Asia. After the civil war broke out in Lebanon, Mr. Maalouf and his family settled in France in 1976, where he continued working for Al-Nahar and then for the weekly magazine Jeune Afrique, rising to the position of editor-in-chief and columnist. Although he discovered his love for literature and poetry through his mother tongue, Arabic, Amin Maalouf decided to use French when he dedicated himself to literature in 1984. Since then, he has published over 14 novels and essays, but also opera librettos. His books have been translated in more than 40 languages, including Urdu, of course. His most famous fiction works include Leo the African, the adventure of the 16th century traveler and geographer who roamed Africa, and Samarkand, a recreation of the life of Persian poet and philosopher Omar al-Khayyam. He has also authored several non-fiction works, including The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, which is the first book of Amin Maalouf I read some time ago. This book is on how this period of the Crusade affected Arab and Islamic societies. And he has also written essays where he has explored the theme of identity and the relationship between politics, religion, and culture in the Middle East and beyond. He is seen by many as one of the most influential writers in the Arab world and on the Arab world. Amin Maalouf has won the Prix Goncourt, which is France's top literary award. This was in 1993 for his novel, The Rock of Tanyos, set in 19th century Lebanon. In 2011, he was elected to the French Academy, succeeding famous anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. He was recently elevated to the rank of Grand Officier of Merit by the French president, and of course, he's an awardee of the Goncourt, as I said. Before I conclude, because ambassadors' speeches are always boring, let me say a few words about the three features which make Amin Maalouf's work absolutely unique and remarkable for me. Number one, I think his books create a lot of empathy. By going beyond the simplistic us versus them worldview, and by telling history from the other side point of view, Amin Maalouf has contributed to shed quite a lot of light on a history shared by the two shores of the Mediterranean and beyond. He has conveyed in the French language and in the translations that were made subsequently some important moments in the history of the Arab world and beyond to the readers across the world. As such, he excels in creating empathy. His stories are not only entertaining, they have a deep philosophical and moral meaning. Second feature, Amin Maalouf's works embrace multiple cultural identities. Amin Maalouf has a gift for juggling between different languages and culture, at the same time highlighting what makes each of these cultures both unique and universal. He seeks to bring people and culture together by embracing diversity, which is one of the very interesting and main features of his native country, Lebanon. As Chilean writer Ariel Dorfman noted, Maalouf explores the labyrinth of identity. It's a journey showing how we, especially in Europe and in the Middle East, are one multiple entity. Third, and last but not least, Amin Maalouf is a cultural bridge builder. By focusing on the openness and permeability of different cultures, Amin Maalouf manages to build bridges between peoples and cultures and to establish a peaceful and fruitful dialogue between human beings. To conclude, I would like to thank Amin Maalouf once again for joining us today. It's a great honor for me to introduce him to the audience and public of Lahore Literary Festival. I hope this will be an opportunity for Pakistani readers to discover or rediscover a great author, a champion of linguistic and cultural pluralism, a voice of wisdom and sanity, who has so much to say on our complex and volatile world, with a strong message on peace, tolerance, and mutual understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. I also had prepared an introduction, but I think you've covered so many different aspects of Amin's life that I'll leave my introduction and I'll move straight into asking questions from him and getting some answers. So, Amin, let's start at the beginning. What made you become a writer after you had been a successful journalist? What moved you or inspired you from writing about the reality of news to writing historical fiction?
I maybe begin by thanking Mr. Ambassador for his words that were very accurate, very generous with me, and not boring at all. So thank you a lot. And I wanted also to say that it was a pleasure for me to accept this invitation. We had spoken, Ahmed and I, with our common friend, Lakhdar Ibrahimi. That was before Corona. We were in a restaurant in Paris, before all restaurants were closed, and they are still closed, unfortunately. And we spoke about the Lahore Festival, and I said it would be a pleasure to be part of it. And so today that's happening. So I begin by answering your question, Ahmed. I never felt that I was changing from one world to another when I moved from journalism to literature. I happened to be the son of a father who was both a poet and a journalist. And for me, both activities were part of the same mindset. And I think I have this mindset of watching the world. That I think that is my passion. From the first moment I opened my eyes, watching the world, trying to understand what is happening around me. And sometimes I try to describe it in very precise words, and sometimes what happens in the world inspires me to imagine stories, or as a German writer, Novalis, used to say, the novels stem from the shortcomings of history. Sometimes when we see what's happening around us, we would like to imagine a different world, and even a quite different human adventure. So my work of fiction is motivated by that vision.
Well, you've described that extremely well. I love the shortcomings of history being fulfilled by literature and by novels. That's very true. Let's talk about Lebanon for a bit. I mean, can you compare for us the Lebanon of 1976, when you left Beirut due to the civil war, to the Lebanon of today, which is still going through multiple crises? It's an absolutely tragic situation in Lebanon. How has that, even at the long distance that you are sitting, you're in Paris and the events are going on in Beirut, how has that affected your writing? Has it made you frustrated, emotional? How has that moved you?
I think it affected a lot my life and my writing. What happened in Lebanon, especially beginning in 1975, was a huge event. And I never considered that it was just a limited event, a short civil war. Sometimes during the last 45 years, people would say, well, the war has continued for 2 years, or for 15 years, or for 20 years. For me, something was broken in 1975. And it was never repaired. Something was broken. And what was broken was my country of birth. And to tell you the truth, I had never thought I would spend my life away from my country of birth. I thought I would spend my whole life there. And after what happened that year, and I was an eyewitness of the first tragic event of the war. After what happened, I understood after a few months that something had changed forever. And I decided at that time to move to Paris. Of course, I changed my scope because I was living somewhere else. I changed also the way I worked, the way I saw the world, and frankly, everything changed. Everything changed. I tried to make the best out of it, but it was shattering for me, like for all people of my generation.
Right. Well, if we move on to your books, in the Muslim world, you're considered to be one of the most popular writers because you've created in some of your novels a kind of Islamic, or a kind of Muslim hero, kind, generous, educated, widely traveled, an explorer, adventurer, and based in fact and real life stories of people who were alive in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries. What encouraged you to look for subjects to write about in early Muslim history? And I'm thinking of particular the Samarkand and Leo, the African, and other such books.
One of the first things I noticed when I moved to Paris is the gap between the two worlds to which I belong, the Arab Islamic world and the Western European world. There is a gap in the vision about practically everything. There is not one event which is viewed the same way in both worlds. And it is not a coincidence that my very first book was The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, because the Crusades, of course, are a very emblematic event, a huge event, which took place during 200 years. And my idea by writing that book was to say everything in history, in the past and today, is seen differently in my country of origin and in my adoptive country. And this does not mean that there is one vision that is true and the other is false. I think truth cannot be approached unless we have many points of view. This is the reality of today. If you want to approach, I don't say to have all the truth, but just to get closer to the truth, we need to look at it from different points of view. Every event in the past and today, if we really want to understand it without all the prejudice that is linked to it, we need to look at it from many points of view. So this is my motto, I would say, throughout my life and throughout, of course, all my writings.
Well, you really have done an extraordinary job, because I remember growing up with your books, and I mean, nobody was writing about the Muslim world the way you were in the 1980s, 90s, and it was really an inspiration. If I can ask you about Samarkand, in Samarkand, perhaps considered as your most favorite novel amongst the reading public, you write about kings and princes, wives and beautiful women, the story of Omar Khayyam and the assassins, and you take the reader then into the 20th century with Jamaluddin Afghani and the setting up of the first constitution in the Muslim world in Iran in 1906. I mean, that's an extraordinary landscape that you cross in a single book. You travel through 400 or 500 years of Muslim history and cover some of the most important events, and you create characters who are historical figures, and yet you create them and put them into this work of fiction. I just wondered how you approached Samarkand when you were writing it, because it is still my favorite book. I reread it in order to ask you these questions, and it's still full of beauty and mystery, and I was just enthralled once again.
I think the history of that part of the world and is in itself full of marvelous events, and I just tried to put them on stage. It's true that the 11th, 12th century, the age of Khayyam, was a beautiful moment in history, and Khayyam himself, as a poet, a scientist, a wise man, he was a huge figure, and I had discovered his rubaiyat in the library of my father and read them, many languages. So I had a passion for him since I was a young boy, and when I began to write, I wanted that one day to talk about him and try to discover his life. And I made a lot of research in order to discover what was his real life, because it's mixed with legend, of course. And another era that is extremely interesting, and I'm still interested, and I might write other things about it. In the beginning of the 20th century, when there were movement throughout the world, and especially in the Islamic world, there were many movements which originally stemmed from one event, one huge event that is, of course, already not forgotten, but it's not an event of which we talk a lot, although it had a huge influence on the history of the world. It was the war between Japan and Russia in 1905. In that year, 1905, people of the East, like my grandfather used to say, people of the East discovered that they could become important in the history of the world. They were not made to be dominated. They could win a war, which they didn't do for the last 2 or 3 centuries. And from that moment, 1905, there were revolutions in Persia and Iran, 1906, in the Ottoman Empire, 1909, in China, 1911, in so many countries throughout the East, there were revolutions with the idea of building modern nations, of changing their ways. And one of the most interesting was the revolution of 1906 in Iran, which I wanted to talk about in that book. And the figure of Afghani was interesting, although he came before. But Afghani is a very pivotal figure in the history of the Islamic world in general. He was, in a way, the father of both nationalism, religious movements, modernist movements. Many things stem from this figure of Afghani, who was a very, very strange personality, Of course, he was not Afghan at all, although he took the name of Afghani. He was from Iran, and well, I could have devoted a whole book about to him, and that was a bit my intention when I finished writing Samarkand, that probably I had spoken too much about him in that book, so it was not. There's no incentive for writing another book talking about him. But he was a fascinating character, and I still read a lot about him.
And I agree with you completely. He's an incredible character, and he walks the stage in India, in Iran, and of course, what you're talking about, the Russian-Japanese War, that also triggered off the slow end of colonialism. That was the first time that a colonial victim had won a victory, and so we're in together, as you say, a different world. I just want to mention one. I reviewed your book Samarkand in 2009 for the Independent newspaper in London. And I just want to read a couple of lines from that review. I wrote, Maalouf has written an extraordinary book describing the lives and times of people who have never appeared in fiction before and are unlikely to do so again. The book is far more than a simple historical novel. Like the intricate embroidery of an oriental carpet, it weaves back and forth through the centuries, linking the poetry, philosophy, passion, and politics of the Sufi past with modernism.
Beautiful.
That linking of the past and the present, you achieve in an extraordinary way. I mean, you know, it's something very difficult to do. I've tried writing a novel, but I write political history, and to move away from political history to write a novel is extraordinarily difficult. How do you cope with this? How did you cope with this?
Difficult to answer. Difficult to answer. I think I try to imagine the lives of those very important people and their lives as human beings. For example, we just spoke about Afghani. One of the tragedies of Afghani's life is that he spent the last years with a cancer in his jaw, like Sigmund Freud at the end of his of his life. And
Right.
the idea of somebody who's trying to imagine the future of a huge part of the world while suffering every day, it was, you know, the human aspect cannot be separated from his role as a political figure. And I think in his life it was intertwined. And I think when we talk about political history, we also need to understand it through the life of the human beings who are on the stage. And it's always very enriching for the story to look at it also from that point of view.
Let me ask you about the Gardens of Light, which describes a true historical moment when the most popular religion of love and tolerance was Manichaeism, and its founder Mani was considered to be a prophet. What attracted you to write about such an obscure religion that has virtually disappeared from the world today?
No, in 1979, I went as a journalist to Tehran in the plane, which carried Ayatollah Khomeini to Tehran. That was on February 1st. We were maybe 200 journalists, and it was a very thrilling experience because we watch history taking place just in front of us. And I still remember when we were taken, we were all the journalists to a kind of theater where Khomeini was sitting on the stage and announcing the birth of the Islamic Republic. So at that moment, I felt extremely interested by the history of Iran. So I read a lot, and the first figure that tempted me to write was Khayyam. So the first time I wrote about Iran, it was about Khayyam. And then there was another figure which was very important in the history, in the Iranian history, who was Mani. Mani is a very strange figure. Of course, the religion he built was didn't last very long. It didn't have the success of other religions. There was only one nation which for some time adopted Manichaeism as its official religion, and that was the Uyghurs in the 6th, 7th century. But after that, it disappeared in the East and reappeared in the West. But that's another story. So it reappeared in France, in Italy, in Eastern Europe, a new kind of Manichaeism. What was interesting about Mani is that he was not only the founder of a religion, he was also a very famous painter. And even now, although Manichaeism has completely disappeared in Iran, the name of Mani is still remembered as a painter, as a famous painter. Unfortunately, we don't have his paintings. Another feature of Mani that he drew alphabets. That was one. So many alphabets in the world have been drawn by Mani. So he's a very, very strange figure. And I had the good luck of discovering a document which was being translated as I was writing my novel, a document about the youth of Mani found in Egypt, and it was written probably in the 4th century, and I used it a lot to find what was his real life, and so the character was very interesting, and so I was tempted to write a novel about him.
How fascinating! Did you write about Zoroastrianism at all? That was another religion that came out of Iran.
Your question is very, very adequate, because I was tempted a lot to write about Zoroastrianism. Maybe if I hadn't written about Mani, I would have written about Zarathustra. The only problem with the history of Zarathustra is Nietzsche. No, his book about Zarathustra is so present in the intellectual scope that it is difficult to put it aside and tell the story in a very different way. So I was a bit discouraged. I don't say that it's not possible, but I was discouraged by the heavy burden of Nietzsche's book about him.
So Iran has fascinated you for a very long time. I mean, if
for many years.
Yeah.
For many years, I'm still very interested, because it's a whole civilization which is very not very well known, and it went through all kinds of phases, and it's fascinating.
You were never tempted to write about the India, the Mughals, any of the civilizations that came up in the Indian subcontinent?
Again, you're right. I was fascinated by one figure who was Ulugh Bek. Ulugh Bek was Timur-Lenk's grandson.
Right.
And he was an astronomer. And when I went to Samarkand, while researching for the book, I discovered the figure of Ulugh Beg, and I was tempted to write something about him.
Yeah.
But well, life is short, so we every day we discover very interesting people, but it's not easy to devote a book. A book takes 2 or 3 years, so I can't. But Ulugh Beg was very interesting, and the whole Mughal story is interesting. The whole Mughal story, Babur.
I've also seen Ulugh Beg's telescope that he built in order to look at the stars, and his wife Gohar Shad came down to Herat and built a madrasa in Herat, which is one of the most beautiful Islamic buildings in the world today. And so both he and his wife, they had a lot of influence in Central Asia and Afghanistan. Let me get your views on another wonderful book, Ports of Call, a completely different novel by you about a love between a Jewish girl and a Muslim boy, divided by the creation of Israel and the new border with Lebanon. The boy ends up in a lunatic asylum, discarded by his family except for his daughter. It's a very strange book for you to write. I would be fascinated to know what prompted you to write this book and what inspired you to write this book.
I think that what triggered the idea of the book was a love story I learned about. It was one of my father's colleagues, journalists, who used to live in Jerusalem before 1948, and who was married to a Jewish young woman. And then the war broke out and they were separated. She remained in Israel. He moved to Lebanon, and they had a daughter, and he after a few years, he managed to arrange meetings with his daughter in Cyprus, I think. So that idea had fascinated me. And I think there were many, many instances of people at that time when they were for many decades, very close ties between Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt. At one point, there was this, something was broken. So the roads were cut, no more traveling between Israel and its neighbors, and many families were cut in two. So that was the first idea that triggered the novel. Another it's always difficult to say where does a novel come from. One of my very dear friends was a great grandson of an Ottoman ruler. And he moved to Beirut also when the Ottoman dynasty lost power in Istanbul. And he told me about his family and how they lived the last years of the Ottoman Empire, and that mixed with the other story, and the novel was born from the mixture of two stories, which I attributed to the same character.
Right, very, very interesting. So this is also rooted very much in the history of Lebanon and what has been happening there and what the people have had to put up with. In 2008, you published your memoir about your family, Origins. And that was followed by the Disorientated, or maybe the publishing dates are wrong because these are the dates in English, in your English translation.
That were the dates in English. Origins, I published it in France in 2004.
All right.
And
Well,
the Disoriented in 2012.
Right. So Origins took another 4 years before it came out in English.
Yeah, exactly.
But I just wondered if this has created some concern amongst your fan club, in which you're now writing, you're now indulging yourself, writing about your memories and your memoirs and the history of your family. And I think people are really asking the most important question, which I think really sums up what this interview is all about. Are you going to go back to writing historical novels about, in particularly the Muslim world, or are you going to be writing about your own family and the origins of the Maaloufs in Lebanon and France?
No, I think about the Maaloufs, I don't think I would write anything else. But what happened with that book, Origin, is that I went once to Beirut from Paris for a family gathering, and I found by chance at my grandmother's house a number of documents, some going back to the 1860s, most of them around the turn of the century. And I discovered a set of letters between my grandfather and one of his brothers who had moved to Cuba. So I wanted to discover the story of that personality who moved to Cuba. And I went to Cuba, and I found our house in Cuba near Havana. And it was a fascinating adventure to go there and to find what traces of our family there, although the great uncle died in 1918, in fact, at the end of the war. So it's a very old story, yet it was interesting to rediscover it. But I don't think I would write other books about the Maalouf family. I think I leave this to other cousins to write it.
Can we expect another novel, historical novel, or not?
Yeah, it's possible. I usually don't know in advance what I would be publishing. In the last few years, I was very much interested in watching the world and trying to understand what's happening, because I think I think the world is on the wrong track, and it's going towards catastrophes. That, as I said in my last essays. So this has taken a lot of time from me, but I listen to your opinion, and I think I will probably try to work on another novel in the near future.
You'll be loved around Asia and Africa and all these places. We haven't discussed Leo the African, but that is really a wonderful book. And just following up on what you said, I mean, what are your thoughts about seeing the Muslim world today? The catastrophes around us, the growth of extremism, ISIL in the Arab world, the failure of the Arab Spring, which is perhaps the most important event that should have succeeded. And if freedom movements in Arab states can bring about pluralism and democracy, we're still waiting for that process to start. And instead, if you look at Tunisia today, Tunisia was the big hope that this would be a flourishing democracy. It hasn't turned out like that. Are you disappointed, and saddened and
I am certainly disappointed. I'm saddened whenever I look to the Arab world and of course to my to Lebanon, to the country of my birth, which is in a very difficult situation. But the whole Arab world, it's an understatement to say it's not its finest hour. we had marvelous moments in history, moments of which we could be legitimately proud, but it's the moments we are living in is certainly not one of those moments. I was enthusiastic when the Arab Spring, as it is called, began 10 years ago. I felt it was a moment, it was thrilling to see so many people rising up and calling for freedom, democracy, the end of corrupt regimes. And it was a moment of joy for me. And unfortunately, it lasted a few months and then it collapsed everywhere. It collapsed. I'm not going to analyze why it collapsed. It's obvious that people who were very enthusiastic were not sufficiently prepared to take power. The movement was spontaneous, but not very well structured. The forces of the power of the regimes, although they are corrupt, although they are not achieving what they should achieve, they're not developing the countries, but they are strong and capable of remaining in power for a long time. It's true in Lebanon too. We have one of the most incompetent political classes in the world, but it is very competent in remaining in power. They know how to manage to stay in power. And it's true, I would say, of the whole Arab world. The regimes know how to stay in power. The people who have the vision don't have the means to realize their dreams. And yeah, it was a moment of joy, but unfortunately, very short moment of joy. And after came the disappointment, a very profound disappointment.
Do you have any particular link to Egypt? Because I think we all see Egypt as being the crucial factor here. The failure of the Arab Spring in Egypt really spelt the failure of the Arab Spring all over the Arab world. And it is tragic the way that Egypt has descended into a kind of censorship and repression and barbarism almost. Do you have a connection with Egypt? And
well, I have a personal connection because my mother was born in Egypt, and my mother's family was in Egypt. And my first visit to Egypt, I was 28 days old, so I used to go to Egypt when I was very, very young. But Egypt, of course, was the leader, the natural leader of the Arab world. Nasser was a huge figure on the Arab stage, on the world stage, and although he was certainly not a democrat, he was in the eyes of the people somebody who represents the people. People recognize themselves in him. What happened in Egypt in 2011 is that there was a beautiful movement. which culminated in the demonstration in Tahrir Square and the fall of President Mubarak. Then the people who were leading the movement were either too young, too unexperienced. They didn't dare move and take power. The power went to the Muslim Brotherhood, which, to be honest, did not want it. They would have preferred to remain backstage because they were afraid of power and of being confronted to the military establishment. But at one point, they felt that there was no other solution but to take the presidency. And when they took power, it was they didn't have the culture of government. They had a culture of opposition. And at one point, in my view, much too early, the army moved and deposed President Morsi. And as you say, the result is certainly not encouraging. I still think that Egypt could have gone in another direction. It could have moved in a way towards more democracy, more development, modernization. I don't know who's the main culprit, but in any case, the result is disappointing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the whole world was disappointed by what happened in Egypt, and we're still looking to Egypt. And unfortunately, it's a military state now, and the Egyptian people are facing great hardship. Let me just end by asking you something. You're a die-hard romantic. You're in all your novels, you draw out beautiful love stories, some of them set in well-known history. What gives you such insight and courage to take on the task of writing about Umar Khayyam in love, for example? Are you being overly ambitious here, or is this just part of your personality? Because you do a wonderful job. I mean, your love stories are absolutely riveting.
I wouldn't say Omar Khayyam in love is the most difficult thing to imagine, because I think he was always in love. He talked a lot about love, and one can imagine that he was very, very often in love. I don't know much about his personal story, but it was not difficult to imagine. And you're right to say that for me, love is important, because after all, there are so many things happening around the world, and they're sometimes distressing, sometimes frightening. And unless we have around us people we love, the world is a very, very lonely place.
Amin Maalouf, I want to thank you very much for the time, and thank you for giving us these extraordinary insights in not only your novels, your work, but also the politics of the region and the literature of the region. Thank you very much. And I pass now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
French ambassador.
It was a pleasure talking with you. Thank you, Ahmed.